Hey, I'm Shailene Louise Bishop, and I'm a watercolor painter and educator. I teach monthly tutorials over on Patreon where I teach you how to paint with watercolor as well as how to draw. And it's also a space where I can answer your specific questions and give you feedback on your artwork. So if you're interested in learning more about Patreon, there's a link somewhere above me and you can find out more information. So in this video, I wanted to just basically give you a demonstration of my teaching style. And I also wanted to take an opportunity to just kind of go over the basics of watercolor. So we're going to talk through supplies just for beginners. And then I'm going to talk about some basic watercolor techniques. And then I'm going to walk you through how I paint this wildflower composition here. My hope with this video is to give you both the tools and the confidence to get started with watercolor and just to show you how fun it is. So on that note, let's get into the good stuff. To get started, I'm going to talk you through some basic supplies. So I'm going to go through just the basics today. If you are interested in kind of a more comprehensive look at the supplies I use, head over to shailenelouise.com/supplies and I'll give you a huge list of all of my favorite supplies, tools, even like tech gear that I like to use. But I just wanted to talk about paints for a moment. So there's two different types of watercolor paints. There is paints that come in pans like this little Winsor & Newton pocket palette set, 12 different colors, all great colors to use. I started off using little like paint pan sets just like this, but I kind of graduated to using tube paints. But I'm going to tell you something that a lot of people get confused about. They're actually kind of the same thing. So I use tube paints, but I put them here on my paint palette and I let them dry. So they essentially become the same constitution as these little paint pans because I let them dry. So they become very, very hard. It's pretty rare that I'll paint with this while they're still wet because you end up using way more than you need. It's just kind of not the right substance. So I let them dry here on my palette. As far as colors go, this is a really great place to start. Just kind of having a couple of every color. So a couple of yellows, couple of reds, couple of blues, couple of greens, some earth colors, which is yellow ochre, burnt umber, and burnt sienna. Those are kind of my go-tos there. So let's talk about paintbrushes. So to get started with watercolor, you do need to have every single type of brush. I'm just kidding. No, I only like to use like very few, honestly. Most of these are just kind of for looks. But I love to use round brushes. So let's see here. Here's a few examples. So this is a size 6 round brush. This is a size 1 round brush. This is actually called a quill brush, but it kind of works just like, it's a very similar kind of tip. There's a lot of different kinds of brushes. I would encourage you, if you want to experiment, see what kinds you like. But for getting started, round brushes, I think those are the way to go. So in this demonstration that I'm going to do shortly, I'll use a size 6 and a size 1 round brush. As far as papers, there are quite a few different options, but I will recommend a couple things. So make sure you're using real watercolor paper. So there's some watercolor paper, sometimes it's 100% cotton, sometimes it's kind of like a student grade sort of synthetic version. Just make sure that whatever you are using it says watercolor on the front because there's other types of paper like, you don't want to use printer paper. Even mixed media to me doesn't work quite as well as true watercolor paper. So I like to use paper that's 140 pounds. It'll say that in the front. Just means it's a nice, good thickness. There's a few different texture types. So this here is like a handmade, very, very textured watercolor paper here. In between that, we have a cold press. So it's got a nice texture to it, but it is pretty subtle. Kind of just has just a little bit of texture, not too much. And then hot press is the most smooth. So I don't see any texture on this. It's as smooth as printer paper. So experiments, have fun. If you're just getting started, I would say cold press is the way to go. Something right in the middle. That's what we're going to use today for the demonstration. So to get started with, I'm going to show you just some some techniques, and then we will get into actually painting some flowers together. All right, so I'm going to show you a few watercolor techniques that I use pretty frequently. The first is called wet on wet. So I'm using cold press paper, using my size 6 brush. I'm going to just dip it in clean water, and I'm just going to paint a little square of water right here on my palette, or on my paper, and grab whatever color. I'm just going to grab this one here called Naples Yellow, and I'm just going to drop some yellow, and notice how the water kind of starts to take it and smooth it out on its own. I don't have to do a whole lot, kind of just dabbing it in there. Okay, so I'm going to clean it off. I have a little jar here for dirty water, a jar for clean water, and I'm going to do one more little square here. This time I'll use a different color. I'll use Windsor Red. And I'm just going to drop some on this side, drop some on this side, and we're going to let it just kind of meet however it will. You can move your paper so that the color moves around, or you can just leave it flat, see what happens. But yes, anyways, that is called wet on wet technique. So it's when we bring wet paint to a wet surface. So another technique is called wet on dry. So that's where the paper is dry, but we bring wet paint to the paper. So I'll grab some green here and do the same kind of thing. This gives us a little bit more control. When the paper isn't wet, you have a lot more control. It's kind of a similar look, but the more you experiment with watercolor, you will see that there is a lot more control with wet on dry, but you can get some really fun effects with wet on wet. So it kind of depends on the style that you're going for. So a technique, the last technique I'll show you as far as, just the applications here, is called dry brush. And that's where we use very, very, very little water. So as little water as we can, but still actually get the paint to move. So I'll just go ahead and use this yellow that's already here. So I'm going to use just a little bit from this kind of residue that's here. Actually, let me do a darker color so you can really see it. I'll do, how about this alizarin crimson? So I'm just going to use just a tiny bit of water. A smaller brush is better for a dry brush technique because a small brush doesn't hold as much water. So I'm using alizarin crimson here, and a dry brush is just kind of a more scratchy look. So just very, very little water. So this kind of goes from least control to most control, okay? So when you're using that dry brush, you're really controlling how much water, how much pigment is in your brush. You're using a small brush, so there you go, dry brush. So let's talk about weights, line weights. So I'm going to start with that size 6 brush, and I will grab, let's do blue this time. So I'm going to really kind of activate this color here. This is ultramarine blue here. Using a bunch of water and a bunch of pigment, I'm really going to just try and fill up this brush, fill these bristles with lots of water and lots of paint. And I'm going to start with the heaviest weight, the heaviest line weight that I can with this size 6 brush. So just kind of pressing it all the way down. It's holding quite a bit of water. Eventually it's going to start getting streaky, but Not yet. So this brush holds a ton of water. And then I'm going to show you how thin I can go with this brush as well. So kind of just turning it to that fine point, just using the very tip. You'll see that there's quite a bit of range with this one brush. So I can do some nice kind of fine details, but then I can also really, cover some real estate on this paper with this brush. So I'll clean that off, lay it down to dry, and let's do the same kind of thing but with a small brush. So I'm going to show you how this brush does not hold as much water. So I'm not going to be able to do that that I just did, but we'll see how far we can go. Just pressing all the way down. It starts to get streaky because there's not as much water in that brush. Okay, so a larger brush is a lot better for when you want to cover a lot of ground, cover a lot of space. Do what they call a wash. A wash of color is when we just kind of put down a bunch of color at once. Okay, so now I'm going to do a really fine weight, which you already kind of saw me demonstrate here with the dry brush. But I'm just going to show you how light I can go with this brush here. Pretty amazing, right? I can even see it in my camera screen here. It's so thin. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you a technique that I use for smoothing color, creating smooth color gradients. So I'm going to pull this down. Let's do, what color should we use? Actually, let's use something we haven't. Let's do some purple. Actually, I'll do Windsor Violet. So really getting this color activated. I'm going to use two brushes. So I'm going to use my other brush, the quill brush, that's a kind of a similar size. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just paint using kind of a wet on dry technique. I'm going to paint some dark purple on the outer edge of this petal, and then I'm going to wet this brush, blot it, so it's just a damp brush, and then I'm going to use that damp brush to smooth this color out. And so I'm creating this like really kind of subtle gradient from dark purple to light purple. And you can kind of just keep working it, figure out how it works for you. It takes a little bit of practice. But this is kind of how I control watercolor. You use a brush to do two different things. You use a brush to drop color, you can use a brush to smooth color, and you can use the brush to lift color. If it's a little too dark, you could use that same brush and lift some color, blot it on your towel. Do the same thing here. Drop some of that dark purple here on the edge, and then use a damp, clean brush to smooth it out. Blot it as you need to. So it takes a little bit of practice, but it's a really great technique for creating those nice smooth gradients. And then I'll just go ahead and paint this side a solid purple color. It's kind of maybe looks like an anemone flower. So there you have it. Those are a few watercolor techniques that I use a lot. But I want to really dig into some more things. I want to dig into some color mixing. So when we paint this, let me find what are we going to paint today? We are going to paint this right here. We're going to paint these wildflowers together. So I'm going to talk you through some color mixing, and I'm going to show you how I do that technique, and how I also, the technique of, creating those gradients from dark to light. And I'm also going to show you how I paint in layers to really build up color values and just make your painting pop off the page. So I have a sketch available for you to download and use as a reference for if you want to draw this out ahead of time, or you can trace it. Go to shailenelouise.com/wildrosetutorial, put your email in the form there, and then I'll email you the link to download the sketch, as well as a photo of the finished version of this painting. And on that note, I think we're ready to get started. For supplies, I'm going to use 3 different brushes today. I have a size 6 round brush, a size 1, and then a quill that's about the same size as that size 6. For paints, I'm using alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, and sap green, and I'm using all of these in the tube form. As I mentioned earlier, I already prepared my sketch, and you can get that at shailenelouise.com/wildrosetutorial. For colors, I'm mixing yellow ochre and alizarin crimson, and I'm going to do just a very, very watery, light layer of wet on dry, and I'm going to apply that color to all 3 of these flowers. So just trying to keep it really, really watery. I don't want this to be a super dark layer. And I'm going to demonstrate in this video how I work in layers to build up color. So we don't start really dark right off the bat. We start with really light colors and then we gradually add some depth. I used my paper towel there because I felt like it was maybe a little bit heavy-handed. Paper towels are amazing tools for that. Up next, I move over to sap green, and I'm mixing that with yellow ochre. And I'm going to do the same technique I did for the flowers, but on the stems and on the leaves. So I'm doing this very light green layer on all of the stems and all of the leaves. As you can see, I went from a size 6 brush and then I switched over to the size 1 because the stems, I really want these to be, you need a little bit more control with the stems because you do want them to be a certain thickness. So using that small brush is going to be helpful. As we learned when we were working on techniques, you just have a lot more control with a smaller brush. Once I have all the stems painted, I grab my larger brush, my size 6, and I'll use that same color that I have to kind of remix as it dries out and as I use it all up. I use that same mixture and I'm going to just paint a wet on dry wash on every single one of these leaves. As I mentioned with the flowers, my goal here is to keep things really light. You will find with watercolor that things seem to dry a little bit lighter than you expect them to. You expect them, like when you paint it, it looks darker than it will in a couple minutes once it dries. So a mistake I see a lot of people make is that their paintings are just super light at the end, and there isn't a lot of depth and a lot of values and dark colors. And the way we get that is with time. We just have to build up those layers. So this is the first pass at this wild rose composition. All right, so now I'm going to start building layers. We're going to do another pass at this whole composition. So I'm going to use my size 6 brush. I am basically just mixing up that color. I want a darker version of that alizarin crimson yellow ochre combo. So I'm going to use that and I'm going to just drop this kind of a darker peachy pink color at the tip of this flower over here on the left. Then I'm using a damp clean brush to smooth that color out. So I really like to use a paper towel as I do this technique, and I'll use it to basically just blot out some extra paint, some extra water, whatever I don't need. You'll find it's really helpful to have a paper towel there with you as you work. And then I'm doing the same thing for this flower up here on the top. So I'm making the front petals just that solid color of a darker pink. And then I'm doing the same technique I did for the first flower by just dropping pigment along the tips of these petals and then using a damp, clean brush to smooth it out. And then for the last petal, I'm just adding a little bit to the top and bottom and then kind of smoothing it out so that it has a nice gradient. Up next, it's time to do another pass at the greens. So I'm mixing a darker mixture of sap green with yellow ochre, and I'm just going to go back to my stems, start to deepen the colors just a little bit. I am right-handed, so it is better for me to kind of start over on the left side and then move over towards the right, just that way my palm doesn't interfere with, getting paints everywhere. So if you're left-handed, you might want to work opposite direction. So I'm using my size 6 brush here for some of these details. And then I switch over to my size 1 brush and I use the damp edge and I start to just smooth out some of that color. So you'll notice I'm drawing those veins in these leaves and I'm just smoothing that out, making it look just a little bit more natural. I really do like to use this smaller brush for details, the size 1 brush. So you'll notice that I am starting to grab some paint from the palette and just dropping in some details here and there. I really like to kind of accentuate tips of leaves and just kind of create just some shadow. I'm not thinking about it too much and really analyzing where the light is coming from. Just kind of trying to lean into my intuition here. But my advice is to try not to cover all of the light parts, because for an interesting dynamic composition, you need there to be light and dark. So for this leaf over here, I want there to be that kind of obvious bend in it. So I'm adding some shadow to the right side so that it looks like, maybe that inside is cast in shadow. For this leaf over here on the top, I made the back curved part a little bit darker. And I'm just doing those little things just so there's a differentiation, so you can really tell the difference in these leaves, and you can really tell that there's movement to these leaves. One thing I will note as I'm working on these leaves just underneath the flower itself, just make sure that when you're touching green to pink, that the pink side is totally dry, or if you're painting the pink, make sure that the green is dried, because you will have bleed in between the two colors and you might not want that. For this painting, I don't want that. There are other compositions that I might like a little bit of watercolor bleed, just kind of for the effect. That would be more of like a loose style, but for this one, I'm going to try and make sure all my colors are just where they need to be. So moving back to these leaves here, I am using my size 1 brush to add these little details. So you'll notice I'm painting these veins, and then I'm using a larger brush to smooth out that color, just using the damp, clean tip of that brush. As I work, I kind of will dip over to my paint palette and just grab color here and there. But in general, you can kind of tell that I'm using 2 brushes, one to drop color, one to smooth color. So now I'm going to do another layer on my flowers. So I'm actually grabbing just pure alizarin crimson for this part. And I want this to be just a very, very dark layer of this rich pink color. And what I'm doing is I'm going to go ahead and drop in the color on all 3 flowers at once before I do any smoothing. And so this is going to help, it's going to allow the paint to dry just a little bit more, just giving it the, 1 extra minute to dry. So it'll be a little bit harder to smooth it as I'm doing right now, but that's okay. I actually want this part, I want this pass at these flowers to kind of create a little bit more of a scratchy effect. So I'm using my size 1 brush and I'm just kind of scrubbing that color downward. So there's not a ton of water in my brush here. It's a small brush, but I'm using what water there is to just smooth out that color, pull it out just a little bit. And I'm sort of creating these little kind of almost veins in those petals
So it's creating these little tiny pink lines that are reaching down into the lighter parts of the flower. So that's really creating some interest, giving the painting just a little bit more interest, I think. So now I'm going to do one of my favorite parts here. I am grabbing just a little bit of alizarin crimson, mixing it into my sap green, and it's creating this super, super dark green. And this is the best for adding those final details to my leaves. So I'm using this really, really dark mixture of green, and I'm just adding some little details here and there. I'm adding some shadow just underneath the flowers. I'm adding some depth to the stem by just adding some dark green to the left side of this stem using my small brush here. And then also I added a little bit of that dark green to just a few little moments in my leaves, specifically the underside of that leaf over there on the left side on the top. And so that's just really going to help to make this painting start to pop. And just as I mentioned earlier, don't cover all of the light parts. You want to make sure that there's this amazing mixture of dark values and light values in this green. Over here where all these leaves are feeling a little bit curved, adding some super dark green to moments there is going to really help to make those leaves pop, make them just be full of interest and just full of dynamic movement. So I'm using that size 1 brush to do all of that. Once in a while I will smooth that out just a little bit. I am dropping even little bits of lighter green in there, just kind of mixing it up here. I love this part of the painting process where I can just kind of add all these little details and start to find ways to make the painting pop. So final moments here in these leaves, just looking for little things I can add. My stems, I felt like they looked just a little bit like the paint lines were a little bit harsh. So I am using that quill brush that's about the size of a size 6 brush. Using that quill brush, that damp, clean edge, to just smooth that out ever so slightly. Just make it look a little bit more soft, a little bit more of like a smooth gradient. And as I mentioned earlier, when you're working on those smaller details like the stems, it is really smart to use a smaller brush. You're going to have more control with the small brush. I feel pretty confident using my quill brush because it has a very, very fine point to it. But if you're kind of unsure, I would always lean towards using a smaller brush for small details and then save the big brush for the spaces where you're dropping a lot of color at once. If you're not nervous about how much color you're going to drop, that's when you can use a larger brush. So last details for my flowers. I'm using mostly alizarin crimson, and then I did the same technique where I just grabbed a little bit of sap green, and it's going to just make it a super, super dark pink color. And I'm just dropping in details in just a few spots where I want there to be just a little bit of drama. I love that effect. A lot of times it looks like it's dark enough, but then when you just add that little tiny, tiny bit at the end, it really just helps it come alive. Then I'm using a damp brush to smooth that color out. And my last detail, I'm using some burnt sienna, using my size 1 brush, and I'm just dropping these little tiny dots there to kind of give the impression of some stamen right at the center of that top flower.
So if you enjoyed this video, I would love to invite you to join me on Patreon, where, as I said, I'm creating tutorials on a monthly basis for you to learn. And if that's just not where you are today, it's all good. I have a different way you can maybe help me though. If you were to like this video and then share it with a friend who you think would be interested in learning about watercolor, that would be so appreciated. So on that note, I'll say goodbye. I hope you enjoyed this video. See you next time.